about Lincoln Part 2. Why this spot instead of a cemetery? Booth was also from a prominent, respected Union family, and that family had the legal right to take possession of Booth's body after the autopsy investigation had concluded. There was no legal precedent or authority for the government kidnapping the body and burying it in an army storage room. Why wasn't Booth's family summoned to identify the body? They were nearby in Maryland, and this is normal protocol. If you died, would they call your family or rely on identification of people on board a ship who never met you? Would they call your parents or a doctor who met you once, years earlier? I would say it's fairly obvious this corpse wasn't Booth. If you have the right corpse, you don't need to create all this ridiculous fiction. We also have a negative ID of Booth's body by Wilson D. Kenzie, 16th New York Cavalry, who was present at the Garrett Barn. Also by his partner Joseph Zing. Both later signed affidavits that the body was not that of Booth. Likewise, Andrew and Luther Potter, National Detective Police agents who were also on the trail of Booth in 1865. They tell that they were ordered not to continue to pursue Booth, although they had made a negative ID on the body. But back to these others, who were said to be buried with Booth in the arsenal. The condemned were hooded, so they couldn't be identified. Also curious is the Mary Certain noose was put into place by Secret Service officers. Why would the Secret Service need to be involved in this execution? Even more curious is that the white hoods were not removed when the bodies were cut down and put into coffins. This is completely contrary to policy since the hoods are for prisoners, not for the audience. It helps to keep them calmer and aid in the execution. Once the prisoners are dead, the hood should be removed, and then the coffins were buried against the prison wall in shallow graves just a few feet from the gallery. What? Do you think that is standard procedure? Well, it gets weirder. In 1867, the War Department decided to tear down the portion of the Washington Arsenal where the bodies of Surratt and the other executed conspirators lay. On October 1st, 1867, the coffins were disinterred and reburied in Warehouse No. 1 at the Arsenal. With a wooden marker placed at the head of each burial vault, John Wilkes Booth's body lay along them. The Arsenal was an army post, not a burial ground. You can't just bury a body anywhere you like, and that was true in 1865 as now. In fact, there was a hospital on the grounds. You don't bury bodies just a few yards from a hospital for health reasons. These hanged people also have families, and those families would have had rights to take possession of these bodies. Just because you are found guilty of murder doesn't mean the government is allowed to kidnap your corpse and bury it anywhere it likes. All these people are known to have had families, but even if they hadn't, a hanged criminal would have been taken to a city morgue and then to a city plot. In no case would a criminal be buried just a few feet from the scaffolding on Army grounds. They admit this was right in the Arsenal courtyard. That would be like burying 4 criminals in the quad at your school and then just building a little fence around it. Study the second frame. Look how close they are to the main building. Does that look like a good place to bury 4 murderers? Speaking of burials, what about the burial of Lincoln? The first strange thing we read is that when Lincoln's body was returned to Illinois, Mrs. Lincoln didn't travel with it because she was still too distraught. Instead, she returned to Illinois about a month later. This meant that Lincoln's own wife missed his funeral and burial, a funeral still called the greatest funeral in history of the U.S., and remember, while she was packing at the White House, her guard was John Frederick Parker, the drunken policeman who left the theater to go next door to the tavern. Do you honestly find any of that believable? First of all, he should have been fired, so that doesn't make sense. But anyways, recent widows are always distraught, but they always manage to attend the funeral and burial unless they have been seriously injured themselves. Mary Todd Lincoln was known to be a tough cookie. The only reason I can imagine why she wouldn't attend her husband is if her husband weren't there to attend. She knew this funeral and burial were fake, so why bother attending? She had better things to do in packing up the White House, since Abe couldn't show himself to help her. We are told that hundreds of thousands of mourners viewed the funeral as it proceeded across the country in late April, but all they viewed was the coffin. They didn't view the corpse directly, since they weren't allowed to pass close enough to see it. So as with these other manufactured events, you have thousands of witnesses to nothing. They think they see, but they don't see. The same problem comes up if we look more closely at Lincoln's medical attendants right after the shooting. Did they take Lincoln to a hospital? No. Curiously, they just moved him across the street to a private home. He was attended by a young Army surgeon who happened to be in the audience at the Ford Theater. Well, wasn't that good? None of that makes any sense. They misdirected you by allowing moles to ask, why wasn't that sent to the White House, which was 4 blocks away? That seems like a good question, but the better question is meant to hide in this one? Why wasn't he taken to a hospital? Washington, D.C. was simply stiff with hospitals. This was only 5 days after the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse in central Virginia. There had been major battles in central and eastern Virginia for many months, and of course, the most eastern of those areas are only a few miles from D.C. D.C. is tacked onto the eastern end of Virginia, so all the hospitals in D.C. were still fully functioning at that time. Among the most significant of these Civil War hospitals were the Army Square Hospitals, Finley Hospital, and the Campbell Hospital. More than 20,000 injured or ill soldiers received treatment in the area of permanent and temporary hospitals in the capital, including the U.S. Patent Office and, for a time, the Capitol itself. Actually, there was 56 hospitals in D.C. during the Civil War, as you can see by going to this site. Here they are numbered for you. As you can see, there are 5 with a few blocks of Ford's Theater, including the Patent Office Hospital, the Union Hospital, Casper's Hospital, and the Presbyterian Church. There was also facilities at City Hall and on the White House grounds. Note that there were medical facilities easy walking distance. We are told the doctors on hand didn't want to subject the president to bumpy carriage rides. Oh my gosh, he's dead. But that is more misdirection. Since these facilities were so close, the president could have been carried by hand on a stretcher by 2 men. No carriage ride was required. We are told the president was taken across the street to Peterson's guest house, but since there was no operating facility there, that is completely illogical. In the real world, Lincoln would have been hand carried on a stretcher to the nearest and best medical facility, and the top surgeons in D.C. would have been rushed over to attend. Since that didn't happen, we know again that the story is fiction. There is misdirection on this point to this day. If you type in the question, why wasn't Lincoln taken to a hospital, the first thing that comes up is this. Dr. Blaine Holmes tries to tell us that the gunshot to the head were 100% fatal in 1865 and still are. That's just an outright lie. Since this was a slug from a Durango, that's a tiny single-shot pistol used mainly as a stowaway weapon. Although a .44 caliber, it had a very low bullet speed, and the bullet was also spinning less quickly due to the short barrel. The truth is, a lot of people have survived being shot by a Durango, even headshots. The kill rate was nothing like 100% in 1865, and is even less now. Dr. Holmes even admits that a paragraph later directly contradicts himself. He says, however, the problem also lies in the different accounts written by the physicians at the autopsy of President Lincoln performed on April 15th at the White House. Unfortunately, depending on which account you read, you'll find that there could have been a different path of bullet. If you only read 1 or 2 of the reports, in theory, Lincoln could have survived, particularly today with our medical care. But if you read all the others, there's no way he could have survived due to the severity of the injury. He just said a few sentences earlier that these events were 100% fatal, and now he is saying they aren't. Given the right trajectory, survival is possible, which takes us to the next problem, the different accounts. How could there be different accounts in an autopsy? There was 1 head, 1 bullet, and 1 path. If we had 2 different accounts, we already have proof that all this is fiction. In a real autopsy, there is 1 account and only one. Only in fake murders do you find multiple contradiction autopsies. All the evidence leads us to the conclusion they had no body, which means the president was never there, which means no one was shot, which means the entire account is fiction. We don't even have any evidence Booth was there. If all the rest of this is fiction, why believe Booth was there, jumped down to fled, etc.? Even if we assume there was some sort of real event that night and that the whole thing wasn't just fed to the newspaper wholesale, we can just get the same story without bothering to include Booth at all. The entire audience could have been planted. Just tell anyone who wants a ticket that night to show up. The show is sold out. Then particularly fill the theater with military and government personnel, especially intelligence people, and run whatever event you like. To fool people on the street, you may wish to actually have guards running in and clearing the place. You may wish to have a body carried across the street to Peterson's, and so on. But all the rest can be achieved with a pen. You just write it down, send it to the newspaper, and job is done. We even have some proof of the above scenario, since although the president was supposed to be in attendance at this very popular play, the theater was about 1/3 empty. You may wish to compare that to the flights on a certain day, which mysteriously only 1/3 full. It looks like the government didn't have enough trustworthy personnel on hand to fill the 2,400 seats in Ford Theater. Note, the part about the account being closed 2 years later. We are told the will was in probate for 2 years as well, but we can now read this as an indication Abe lived another 2 years. Why else would his insurance account stay open 2 years after his death, or his will to be in probate for that long? This also reminds us of that, as with so many other events we have covered, think the Titanic. Insurance fraud may have been part of that story here. As we have seen in papers after this one, these families like nothing better than a big insurance fraud, especially if it includes a fake death. It is seen as the easiest of money. I suppose a lot more could be said on this event, and I may return to it later. But I feel we have already shown you the main event evidence. In my opinion, the murder is solved. There was no murder. If you aren't convinced, or at least intrigued by now, I doubt you ever will be. I will only take a moment to answer a couple of questions and tie up a couple of loose ends. Some will ask me, what happened to Booth? Did he escape from the barn and all that? Well, no, there never was any barn, and no one was ever killed in that event either. That was just another fake and planted story. The body they used was of a Confederate soldier already dead. Kinsey and Zegan swore that the body they saw at Garrett's farm wore a gray uniform and yellow brogan and had a red mustache. They knew that Booth had shaved his mustache because they had already visited Dr. Mudd, who had told them that himself. Andrew Potter tells much the same story. We have been told by alternative theorists that Booth escaped to Texas or India or somewhere, but I don't believe it. The reason I don't believe it is I know Booth was in the Union intelligence. I also know he was very wealthy and famous. He already had a great life, so to convince him to sell out his name and reputation in future would be very difficult or impossible. I simply don't believe he was the patriotic. Given what we have discovered, the best guess is that he didn't agree to it. Remember, always check off the most likely things first, before moving on to the less likely. Since we have seen that Lincoln was not where we are told he was, we should assume Booth was also not where we were told he was. They could only use Booth's name in this event because he was already gone. Like Lincoln, he was gone long before the event even started. It is convincible Booth switched sides sometime in late 1864. He had been hanging out with intelligent assets from both sides for years, pretending to be a Confederate but actually being Union. It is possible he got a great offer from the South and moved down there, but I think it is much more likely he got caught in his own schemes and was murdered by Southern agents while in a costume and under an alias. Because he was under an assumed name, they didn't know they had killed John Wilkes Booth, so they just buried him. Those in the Union intelligence discovered Booth had been murdered as a spy at the same time they were working on the fake assassination. They needed a fall guy, so they decided to use Booth. They simply neglected to publicize his death. To buy time, they made up a story about him going to Canada for a while. You will say he was seen in plays up until March 1865. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. That fake is also very easy to pull off. You hire an actor who looks like Booth and pay the local theater critics to say he was smashing. Only a few smart people in the audience figure it out. Okay, but do we have any evidence for this theory? In fact, we do. We have a photo of the three Booth brothers acting in Julius Caesar's in late 1864. Unfortunately, that is an obvious paste up. It is fake. How do I know? Simple research and good eye. That is supposed to be John to the left, Edwin in the middle, and Junius to the right. Even without examining the photo closely, we know it again contradicts the mainstream story. By 1864, Edwin and John are supposed to be totally estranged. We are told that Edwin would neither talk to nor work with John. So how did they convince them to work together here? They didn't. John wasn't in the play, and the photo is false. Did you know that Junius was 17 and a half years older than John and 12 years older than Edwin? He should have been a month shy of 44, while John was just 26. It's that how it looks to you? It isn't how it looks to me, but there is much more. Let's look at some real photos from that time of these guys. I don't have the photos in this message, but you can go to his website, which I give at the end, and you can look at all the photos because he does a great job of putting lots of photos in all of his different messages. That was real professional photos of the time look like. Compare them to the photo above. See a problem? If you don't, I will point out a few for you. Look how small Edwin's foot is compared to his head. Look at John's arm. Why is it short and white? Now compare the black tones in Edwin to the black tones in John. The hair is a good place to compare, but you can compare all the blacks in the eyes, robe, and sandals. See how Edwin is darker overall than John? John's blacks are all 2 steps grayer, aren't they? Now look at the shadows beneath the 3 men. Although there are shadows under the other 2 men, there is no shadow under John. You will say it is because his skirt is higher, but look at the little dark lines around his feet. Even these small shadows don't match the other guys. The blacks aren't black enough, and there are no shadows falling to the right, as from his raised heel. The focus of the whole photograph appears off as well. Do you think they paid a photographer to come in and take a picture of them in costume, only to realize this one that is out of focus? No, the photographer takes a set of photos, and one will surely be better quality than this. Whoever released this fake photo back in the day purposely released it in low resolution to help hide the paste seams and other anomalies. I would say all 3 heads have been pasted on just to start. Notice the halos around all 3 heads. It is especially obvious with John. Look at the light band around his hair to the left. This tampering with a famous photo is proof John wasn't there. If he wasn't there, then where was he? Why were they faking his whereabouts in late 1864? This strongly supports the death hypothesis. He was too famous and too handsome to disappear in the South or West at the time, especially with his picture in all the papers, and he would not have wanted to disappear anyways. He had it too good where he was. You will say no reward was offered for Booth beyond April 26, but reward or no reward, a lot of people hated Booth. Many knew there was a question mark over his death. He wouldn't have been safe anywhere in the U.S., much less comfortable. That's why I don't think he would agree to have his name used, not even for a large sum of money. He already had money and fame. They would have to move him overseas, but why would he want to go overseas? Even Europe wouldn't be safe. It wasn't safe for Surratt, as we have seen, and Surratt was much less famous, much less handsome, and much less wanted. Booth wouldn't move to India or South America or anywhere else, since that would be a big step down for him, no matter how much money he was offered, and I don't see him agreeing to be used for this job. The people who agree to relocation are people who are doing well where they are. But Booth had it made. He was rich, handsome, famous, working for Union intelligence, and about to wed a senator's daughter. There is no logical way to explain this except that he was already dead and they just borrowed his name. We find support of the idea of an early death from his bio where it is admitted Booth had a health problem. He retired from the stage in 1863 due to breathing problems. He was awfully young to be retiring due to breathing problems, so possibly he died of tuberculosis or some other malady. It is not my research that discovered that. It is the new book on Lincoln by Sonora and Chapwell, who are Jewish themselves. And in the testimony of Booth's sisters, Asia and brother Edwin, both stated that their father was Jewish, attending synagogues and speaking Hebrew. The authors also admitted that Lincoln attended a performance of The Merchants of Venice in which John Wilkes played Shylock. Why is this worth mentioning? Because Shylock was a Jewish banker. We may assume that it is meant to depict that the devil made him do it. However, do you notice anything strange? How about the extraordinary Jewish nose on the devil? We either have some anti-Semitism going on here, or the artist is trying to tell us something. And what is the devil wearing? Are those Jewish robes of some sort? A reader looked up the full image, and it confirms my reading. Not only do the robes look even more like Jewish ceremonial robes, but we see the full feather, which is the phoenix feathers. Look a bit like a peacock feather, you will say, but look up for Sheenish feather, you will find a direct match. And Booth is once again hiding a hand, this time behind him. I also send you to Spielberg's film Lincoln, where just before it is announced that Lincoln has been shot, a strange little phoenix also sent to you to Spielberg film Lincoln, where just before it strange phoenix arise from the stage for no apparent reason. See minute 2 hours, 17 minutes and 10 seconds. This play is Aladdin, and he was just killed the sorcerer, so there is no reason for a phoenix to be rising from behind him. I take this as a signal from the Jewish Spielberg that he knows this is a fake. That was spotted by a reader, but I spotted another one myself just now. At minute 1:16, Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln begins talking about Usalid with a younger engineer, again for no apparent reason. It has nothing to do with the plot and seems utterly manufactured, but why? Just so that Lewis could make the pyramid sign with his hand, another signal of the same sort. Later, after Lee's surrender, Mary asks Abraham what he wants to do now. He says he wants to go to Jerusalem to see the places where David and Solomon walked, a place he had dreamed of walking himself, which reminds me, Daniel Day-Lewis did succeed in making Lincoln look very Jewish, though I doubt he intended that. It was just in the blood and couldn't be helped, but I think we all expected Lincoln to have a lower, more powerful voice. Lewis's high, chirping voice sounded more like Don McLean than what any of us imagined of Lincoln. Many of the other major characters in Lincoln also appeared far more Jewish than most would have predicted, especially Seward, Wood, Yeaman, Lytton, and Speed. But since they were all Jewish, Spielberg was actually giving us a clue there as well, though I am sure few got them. Oh, and remember who wrote the script, Tony Cushman. The film was based on a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, Neen Kearns, also a wit, Pendergast, and a miller whose father was named Aloysius. See Hitler and Schwarzenegger, among others, who are also Aloysius. Her husband was Richard Narrowd of Goodman, Jewish. The Kearns are in the peerage related to the McKinleys, who we saw above were related to the Lincolns. So Doris is a relative of Lincoln. Doris's grandfather came over from Ireland, and although he is scrubbed at Jenny, the Kearns there were and are related to the Brapparats, Rutherfords, Livingstons, Esmonds, Burkes, and Douglasines. And then it talks about all that. He was also gay, so we are hitting all the stops on the G-A-Y Jewish actor who faked his death line. For proof he was Jewish, see this 2019 research by Jewish authors from the University of Virginia, who use a 5,000-person DNA database to prove there was a Jewish colony in Akbabashash from the 16th century. Here is a quote from it sent to me by a Jewish reader. These findings suggest that Lincoln's family was originally Jewish of either Shefron or Ashkenazi ancestry. That is originated in the southeastern Europe and then migrated both northward toward Russia and southward toward Spain and Italy, as well as westward toward England. Abraham Lincoln is reported to have told a rabbi that you are a flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. That is, we are both Jewish, as reported by Rabbi Isaac M. Wise in the eulogy from Lincoln after his assassination. In-text commentary on this include the fact that Lincoln and Jewish relatives named Sanders, probably linking him to Bernie Sanders as well as to Ben Franklin, who was also a Sanders. These authors also admit Daniel Boone, David Crockett, and Hernando de Soto were Jewish. They imply Christopher Columbus was Jewish, though you have to read closely. As for the GAY question, you only have to start at Wikipedia and take links where you will find much evidence for it, including comments by Carl Sandburg. It isn't just a vague suggestion anymore, since lovers have been named. As he admitted, he had not only lived with Joshua Fry Speed for many years, but slept in the same bed with him. Speed was also Jewish, since he was descendant from John Speed, who came from a family of tailors of the Merchant Tailor's Guide. His wife was a draper, which indicated the same thing, of course. John Speed became famous as a cutter, and the first map he published was of Canaan. Yet another clue in the same direction. Joshua Speed was also an Adams and a Warner. Debunkers claim Lincoln and Speed slept in the same bed as a matter of economically, since Lincoln was allegedly poor at the time. Unfortunately, that explanation breaks down immediately, since Speed was very wealthy. His grandfather was judge and land inspector who owned 45,000 acres in Kentucky. Speed's father was a plantation owner, being among the largest slave owners in the state. At the beginning of his relationship with Lincoln, Speed was already a successful merchant, and while they were betting together, Speed also came into a large inheritance. When Speed left after 4 years to return to the plantation, Lincoln broke his fake engagement to Mary Todd and followed him there. It was later decided this wouldn't do for Lincoln's career, and history became as you know it. Speed also later married but never had children. We have 3 of the 4, GAY, Jewish, and faked his death. Since he was president, I think we can give him, the actor, making it a grand slam. So there you have it. We have passed through the bog and come out at the other side. I think you'll admit that this theory, through astonishing on a first read, is actually much less extreme than most other alternative theories of Lincoln's death, because the mainstream story was seen to be full of holes from the beginning. The alleged assassination had generated mountains of speculation. Those who have studied these theories know that just about everything imaginable has been proposed to fill these holes. I think my explanation is far simpler, far more logical, and it fits the known facts far more gracefully. And although it points to the finger as hidden players, it points to hidden players we know who were there. We know military intelligence was active during the Civil War. Intelligence wasn't invented until 1947. So the involvement of intelligence is the natural first assumption, not the involvement of extra-international cabals. Even if we accept the existence of extra-international cabals, they are not needed here. We have explained it without them. You may not wish to insert them wherever I talk about powers behind Lincoln, but that is beyond the period of his paper. Faking a murder is well within the capabilities of local intelligence. Even a murder of this prominence. In fact, most of the alternative theories look like purposeful misdirection to me, simply because they fail to consider the most likely answers first. In any real investigation, an investigator crosses off the simplest and most likely scenarios first, proceeding to less likely ones, only when those simpler ones fail to fit the evidence. When an investigator of a murder comes across a mountain of evidence of tampering and fakery and lies, his first question should be, was there a murder at all? Only when he is convinced of the murder itself does he proceed to asking further questions. Given the story we have been told, we should never have been convinced of the murder of Lincoln. We never have had real evidence for it. All the evidence we have had is clearly pushed. So we should then look for evidence he wasn't murdered. As it turns out, there is actually a lot of that evidence buried just below the top layer of the falsehoods. I recommend you remember that when looking at any subsequent event, my simple method is useful when looking at any murder, and you can now apply it to hundreds or thousands of famous cases to see if they hold up. I just found an entire layer I missed the first time. It required a very close and extended study of the genealogy charts in the mid-1800s, which I later ended up doing as part of the research for many later papers, including my paper on Lizzie Borden, my paper on F. Scott Fitzgerald, and so on. Only by cross-referencing these many genealogy searches was I able to discover that all the families are closely related. That is to say, as the research related to this paper, we find that Todds were related to the Surgetts. They were also related to the Booths, Parkers, and Rathbones. So we find more evidence this was all an inside job. They choose people from their own families to play the parts in the hoax. Remember, Henry Rathbone was the one who allegedly fought with Booth in the theater box before the shot was fired. 2 Surgetts were among the alleged conspirators. So you should find it highly suspicious to discover all these people were closely related, mainly through Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd. The genealogy sites have scrubbed the first layer of relationships, so it is not obvious on first glance. However, once you discover the connecting families, you can make the link indirectly. For instance, the links to the Rathbones wasn't made for me until my paper on Mabel Dodge Lutheran, where I discovered her great-grandmother, Lucy Anderson, had married twice, once to John Gannison and once to Israel Rathbone. Israel's father and Henry's grandfather were brothers. Henry Rathbone's full name was Henry Reed Rathbone. That links us to my paper on John Reeds as well. The Rathbones were also related to the Barrells. See Elizabeth Rathbone, who married Amos Barrells. That links us to my paper on the Beat Potes and William S. Bergs, among others. Well, the Gansons were also related to the Gates, as I showed in my paper on Mabel Dodge Lutheran. So were the Rathbones. Isaiah Rathbone married Molly Gates. Isaiah was a half-brother of the Rathbones. One of his descendants was Hirata Gates Spafford Rathbone, father of Eden Chapman. Anyway, the Gates were related to the Todds. See Sarah Todd, who married George Williams Gates, Sr. in around 1830. This Gates was the son of Jerusha Russell Clark, which ties us to the Clark and Russell family as well. We saw the Russells involved in Lizzie Borden hoax. So the Rathbones were related to the Todds through the Gates. The Rathbones were also related to Booth. To discover this, I had to trip across a book at Google Books called A History of the Old Town of Stratford and the City Bridgeport, Volume 2. See pages 1331 and 1332. There we find Reverend Ashashkaman marrying a Phoebe Walker of Stratford, CT. His mother was Sarah Booth. Their last son, Charles, married Elizabeth Rathbone, daughter of John Rathbone of New York, but the Booths and Todds were also related directly. See France Todd Booth's mother of Confederate General William Booth, Trafalgar. Her grandmother was a Todd. So just to be sure you got it, John Wilkes Booth and Abraham Lincoln were closely related through Mary Todd. Remember, Mary Todd's grandfather was General Lee Todd, meaning he was also Jewish. Mary's father was a rich merchant and a banker, so when you are told Lincoln was fighting the bankers with his greenbacks and so on, remember that his own father-in-law was a banker. Levi Todd's wife was a Bridge, whose grandmother was a McKinley, linking those two presidents. Levi's mother was an Owen from Wales, linking us to the Stanleys and the Tudors. The Tudors were really Owens from Anglicea. This probably explains why Mary Todd's cousin and John Wilkes Booth's father, Hunos Booth, named their estate in Maryland Tudor's Hall. In fact, there are over 1,000 Booths in the British Peerage, and they are related to everyone. These Peerage Booths had been in the U.S. since the beginning, helping found New York. They were in Suffolk, New York by the 1620s. Before that, they were from Cheshire, where they were related to the Waterburn, Brestons, and Stanforys. See Sir Williams Booth, 1578, who married a Warburton. Her great-grandmother was Jane Stanley, granddaughter of Thomas Stanley, First Lord Stanley. This links us immediately to Bermonts and Nellivers, taking us back to John of Gaunt. But are the Maryland Booths linked to these New York Booths? Of course. They admit John Wilkes Booth was a relative of John Wilkes, Lord Mayor of London in 1774 and 75, who is listed in the Peerage. So there were not some downmarks, nobody Booths. They were the Booths of the Peerage. Though they have otherwise been scrubbed from it for obvious reasons, the last thing they wanted you doing is linking John Wilkes Booth back to Sir George Booth, 1st Baronet, since that takes us back to the day Clintons and Fitzrots, and from there to William the Conqueror and Charlemont. It's also the same story. We later saw the same thing in the genealogy of James Earl Ray and Lee Harvey Oswald. Both those fake assassinations are also related to their targets as well as to the kings of England and Scotland. What about the Shirretts? We have seen the Shirretts were related to the Fitzgeralds. That is admitted in F. Scott's Fitzgerald's bio. They were also related to Scotts and Keys. Susan Scott Key's daughter, Mary Hunter, married John Shirrett beyond that. Mary Shirrett's mother was Elizabeth Webster, which brings that family into as well. The Shirretts were also related to the Jacobs. See Alicia Shirrett, who married Jan Jacobs in about 1825. This ties into my Leo DiCaprio paper. Anyway, I send you to the first genealogy of John Wilkes Todd, father of Harvey Webster Todd. That sort of kills two birds with one stone, since you see the link to both Wilkes and Webster there. You can also go here to see the marriage of William Webster and Mary Ann Todd in about 1855. Then we have Edith Webster Todd, daughter of Thurin Todd and Hayti Webster. While we are here, I thought I would remind you that Daniel Webster's granddaughter, Carolyn Appleton, married Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte II. His grandfather was the brother of Napoleon, which of course ties us to a paper on him. Daniel Webster's mother was an Eastman, and we have seen that name come up many times as well, most recently in my paper on Lizzie Borden. Lizzie's mother was a Morris, and we found Eastman in her recent ancestry. There were also Eastmans involved in the Salem witch trial. We have seen the Clark's family come up already. Well, the Booths were related to the Clarks. See Asia Frigga Clark, nee Booth. She was a sister of John Wilkes Booth and the wife of John Sleeper Clark. Curious, he took his mother's name instead of his father. He was born John Clark Sleeper. His mother, Georgian Clark, has been thoroughly scrubbed, indicating they are hiding something important, but not hiding it well, because the name Clark is enough. It ties us to the Todds once again, since Mary Todd Lincoln's brother was named George Roger Clark Todd. He was named for George Roger Clark, son of Captain William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. The Todds were also related to the Owens. George Roger Clark Todd's grandfather was Levi Todd, son of David Todd and Hannah Owens. This links us to my paper on Frederick Ingalls and Robert Owen, two of the founders of the communism. Also useful is the genealogy of James Clark Todd of the Kentucky Todds, early 1800s. He married Maria Blair, linking us to Tony Blair, of course, and their son was Lyman Beecher Todd. He married Sarah Swift, linking us to Taylor Swift, in about 1850. She was the daughter of Stephen Swift and Louisa Tarbell. We just saw the Tarbells come up in my paper on Lizzie Borden, where the ex-governor of Massachusetts was George Robinson. He was her defense attorney. He was also descendant from Tarbells, but it gets better. Stephen Swift's mother was named Thankful Hort, not a joke. We saw that surname in my paper on F. Scott Fitzgerald. Scott's editor was Maxwell Perkins, whose mother was a whore. Jennifer Aniston is also a whore. There was a Dorcas whore at the Salem witch trial. Thankfully, whore's mom was a Sylvanus Pierce, and we saw that surname in my paper on Lizzie Borden, related to all these people. We can also put in a Jackson, since Stephen Swift's grandmother was Anna Jackson. This probably ties him to President Andrew Jackson, among others. Anyways, Jeannie breaks the lines of James Clark Todd, giving us no father. They also appear to give an incorrect date for his birth of 1804 to throw us off. But we have changed that date to 1802. We find another James back into the line of Georgia Roger Clark Todd. This proves the name Clark is not an accident. It is a family name indicating Todd had a son and grandson of that same name. The first of these, James Clark Todd, married Mary Boone Bryan of the famous Bryans, C. Williams Jennings Bryans, who took part in the fake Scopes monkey trial. Her great-grandmother was Sarah Russell. She is scrub, but she may be from the Russell family. We saw in the Lizzie Borden hoax linking us to Russells of the peerage. If we follow these Bryans in the Todd genealogy, we find some of them changed their names to Bergen in around 1915. That's curious and may tell us something about the famous Bergens after all. These Bergens also give us another important link. Mary Boone Bryan's great-grandfather was Daniel Boone Bryan, and his wife's mother was Catherine Scott. She was the daughter of Joseph and Eleanor and the sister of John. This links the Scotts to the Todds, linking Francis Scott Key to Abraham Lincoln, a relationship the mainstream says does not exist. Of course, it also links the Shurents to the Todds once again, since it admits that the Scotts and the Shurents are related. Now, what about the drunken police officer John Frederick Parker, who was allegedly next door at the pub while Abe was getting himself assassinated? He was also later the personal guard of Mary Todd Lincoln at the White House, indicating some relations aren't being told. Hold on to your hats, because this is the closest relationship of all. Mary Todd Lincoln's mother was Anna Elizabeth Park. These Parks were also rich merchants, and they were cousins of the Todds. Anna had a brother, Archibald Parker, who is listed as having no children. John could have been his son. Mary Todd Lincoln had a great uncle named John Parker, and his son was also named John Parker. His grandfather and great-grandfather were named John Thomas Parker. The most recent of these, John Parker's 1797, is scrubbed, as you would expect. But again, he could have had a son, that son being John Frederick Parker. We find John Frederick Parker bio-scrubbed as well. But when you're told he wasn't related to the Parkers in Mary Todd's line, you shouldn't believe it. Do you really think it is just a coincidence that this suspicious drunken policeman had the same name as 4 of Mary Todd's close relatives? Studying the Parker line gives you yet another link. Mary Todd's great-grandfather was James Parker, and his sister was Lucy Parker. She married Charles Key, which is, of course, just a variation of Key. Some of the family later dropped the S. This once again links the Todds and the Keys, which not only links Francis Scott Key to Abraham Lincoln again, it links Lincoln to the Shurents one more time. It is also worth mentioning that Mary Todd's sister Elizabeth married Ninan Wirt Edwards. His brother was Albert Gelton Edwards, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln. We are told he was named for Albert Gelting, treasurer under Jefferson and Madison, but he was actually related to them. Like many others, this Albert Galstone is sold to us Swiss. If you believe that, I don't know what to say. Have your eyes checked? Maybe the little song will jog your memory. You gotta pick a pocket or two. His real first name was Abraham. He was a wealthy merchant from a family of wealthy merchants and obviously Jewish, which is why I thought him worth adding in here. It reminds us of all these people were Jewish. Gatlin's second wife was Hannah Nicholson. The Nicholsons were related to the Edwards through the Bells. See Thomas Nicholson Bell. In 1797, Maryland, for one example, Bell's mother, Serene, was scrubbed. But my guess is it's a Nicholson. The Bell and the Edwards intermarried many times in the same period, indicating Albert Galston Edwards wasn't just named for Albert Galton. He was a great nephew or something. But let's back up a bit. I hope you also noticed the middle name of Ninian Wirt Edwards. Remember Wirt Walker, related to George Walker Bush? That is no coincidence. Wirt Walker, 3G's grandfather, was Solomon Walker in New Hampshire, who married heiress Chatty Stevens, granddaughter of Elisha Stevens. So we are looking at more crypto-Jewish here. Either this Solomon Walker or his family previously married a Salut Dillon. These Dillonis were partners in Russell and Company, apparently an arm of the East Indian Company, which imported opium from China. The Dillona family later spit out Franklin Delano Roosevelt, among others. Russell and Company links us to my recent paper on Lizzie Borden, since Russell was governor of Massachusetts at the time. He was related to Samuel Russell of Russell and Company, and also to William Russell's, who founded Skull and Bones. The Walkers and Bushes were and are Skull and Bones. The Forbes and the Opslows were also involved, both in Skull and Bones and an investor in the Walkers Enterprises, and we have seen them recently as well, especially in my paper on John Forbes Nash and Nathan Hawthorne. The name Ninian Wirt Edwards tells us that the current John Edwards, John Kerry, and the Bushes are all related. They are also related to the Roosevelts. They admit some of these relationships, but try to spin them as a very distinct. They aren't very distinctive. I have found in my research that they hire some fake genealogy to tell us the relationships are something like 16th cousins 10 times removed, when they are actually 4 cousins twice removed or something. In other words, they point you to the common ancestry in Europe in 1600, overlooking the common ancestries in the U.S. in about 1850. The Deloney links above take you to the 2010 paper by that date, Kevin Ryan, where we learned something else interesting. Solomon Walker John James Monroe Walker was president of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad in the mid-1800s. He also controlled the Union Stockyards, the Kansas City Stockyards, and the Wilmington Coal Company. Finally, he was involved in Russell & Co., the trader in opium, and was backed by many of the billionaires of the time. It was opium money that financed these other veterans in these projects. Walker worked with Nathan Thayer and Sidney Bart. Sidney and Jonathan Barton are mentioned many times in the paper of Bacon Samuel Chase. This is because Russell & Crowe was just an arm of the giant merchant bank, including Baring Brothers and N.M. Rothschild. If you don't know why I bold those two names, see my paper on artist Bull Bartlett. I propose there's a link between Bartlett and Rothschilds, based on admitting circumstantial evidence, but we are finding here supports that link. A further search on Sidney Bartlett takes us here, where we learned much about the family. Apparently, Sidney Bartlett had a son or brother named William S. Bartlett, who was a very wealthy Orange County banker. He had a grandson or nephew, Leonard Bartlett, who was a Hollywood screenwriter and Los Angeles Times reporter, and a grandson named Sidney Leonard Bartlett, who was a Von Vitt. This last Bartlett briefly married the actress Ursula Shagir. He was also U.S. Vice Consul in Casablanca and a spy. I found no direct link from him to Beau Bartlett, but I did find some indirect links. For a start, Beau's real name is James William Bartlett III. Here we will find Sidney Bartlett, 1894, to James William Bartlett, and here we will find James William Bartlett with a brother and sister named Israel. Anyway, back to the Edwards line. In about 1800, the Edwards married into both the Green and Warfield families. Lucas Edward married Jen Duff Green of Maryland. Rachel Edwards married William Warfield of Maryland. We have seen both in recent papers. John Reed's grandma was a Green. His bio is scrubbed. Wallis Simpson's Duchess of Windsor was actually Bessie Warfield. We saw the Warfields in my paper on F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Edwards were also related to the Muse. Hadrian Edwards of this line was the son-in-law of Mary Muse. We saw that the Muse in my paper on Eustace Mullins, whose mother was a Muse. Which brings us to the other thing I showed in that paper. The Muse were related to the Booths, which links the Booths to all these families one more time. To reiterate what I have just shown you is that Abraham Lincoln was closely related to most of the major conspirators in his fake assassination. It was a family affair. This, of course, acts as more strong evidence the whole story was manufactured by these families to sell another one of their hoax. Much more research could and should be done on these linking genealogies, and I suspect I will continue to expose it in upcoming papers. Every paper I write tends to take us back to these families who are at the center of the long lie, now sold as history. For some, this essay has likely been overly long already, but for those whose eyes are still in their heads, I have a few more comments. I will remove the investigator's cap and change my tone a bit for this. I still won't act the historian since I was never interested in straight reportage. I will put on the cap of the philosopher or legislator. After discovering what I've discovered, it occurred to me that I wasn't feeling the disgust I might be expected to feel from this whole charade. In fact, I found I was more offended by the vote stealing in the election of 1864, what with the requirements of oath and so on, than I was by the faked assassination. With the faked murder, I felt I could understand the need for it due to circumstances. It was a magnificent fraud, assuredly, and I would never defend fraud. And yet I could see so clearly why and how it happened that I was tempted to passport part of the blame to the farmers of the Constitution, who through sheer negligence once supposes allowed it to occur. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and in fact this wasn't the only thing that had happened. As we had seen from the vague wording of Article 1, set this whole thing up. So let us study the problem and the solution. It appears the author of the Constitution didn't wish to allow a president to resign due to ill health or other reasons. They appear to have assumed, for reasons that aren't really clear, that no president would simply wish to quit. They wrote Article 1 assuming ill health would either lead to a cure or death, and they included language to cover both possibilities. But they didn't foresee a third possibility, lingering ill health, that would not lead to a death, but that would lead to the permanent inability to govern. They also didn't foresee that even ill health lingering for a short time could cause a crisis in times of emergency. Since an acting president would not have the authority of a full president, and they clearly didn't foresee how loopholes in the rule of Article 1 would lead to expiration of those loopholes, which is precisely what happened in 1865. It appears they didn't want a president just passing the ball to the vice president for no reason, since that wouldn't have allowed a candidate to get into office on false pretenses by a sort of chiral gamut. But the only thing they did to prevent that was to make it impossible for a president to just retire without a scandal. Under the current language and customs, any retirement not due to ill health would be seen as scandalous and would negatively affect the vice president as he became the president. We saw that with Ford as he succeeded Nixon. Therefore, to successfully run as chiral gambit, pretending you are running one candidate while really running the other, they have to fake the death of the president. That allows the new president to govern with augmented authority rather than dismissed authority. That is what we saw in the above analysis. Now, the Constitution is a wonderful document in many ways, but in other ways it is a terrible document. It proceeds on many issues is sold to us as a strength, but in most cases it is nothing but a weakness. The Constitution is mainly a piece of legislation, and vagueness in legislation is never a plus. The brevity of the Constitution is admirable, but it could be almost as brief and 10 times as powerful with the right wording. The authors of the Constitution did not take full account of human nature, by which any loophole is surely to be exploited. Admitting that vague language should be avoided at all costs, and any loopholes discovered later should be immediately filled. This has simply not happened. The loopholes have been exploited with even more fantastic gamuts. To prevent this gamut, you could do one of two things. Most instances would be to stop by adding a clause to the effect that any president who dies or quits for any reason not due to scandal in the first year of office will not be succeeded by the vice president. The vice president will become acting president only while a special election is called. This special election must be called immediately, and in fact, no one has to call it. Oh, that would be nice if we could do that today. As soon as the president dies or resigns, the election is understood to be called already by the Constitution itself. The actual voting should take place within 6 weeks, in times of war, 3 weeks. All instances of the gambit should be prevented by extending the clause over all 4 years, instead of just the first year. If I have still missed something, what I have missed should also be filled with precise language. I will be told that these quick special elections don't allow time for the public to learn about candidates, but that argument is mostly a diversion. The public now has 2 years of campaigning to endure, and the end learns almost nothing of the value. If campaigns were really honest, you could learn everything you needed to know about candidates in a matter of weeks. In dishonest campaigns, you will be prevented from learning anything to the point regarding. Short campaigns therefore limit the amount of possible propaganda and are to be preferred for that alone. Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1967 to clarify Article 1, but it fails to do it. It clarifies a couple of minor issues, but does nothing to close the big loophole. There are easy solutions to most constitutional problems, but no one seems interested in discovering them and implicating them. The Constitution is normally seen as either scapegoat or just a piece of paper. It is neither. Any loopholes discovered should be immediately and completely filled, lest fraud ultimately run rampant, as it is. Another problem is that the Constitution rarely sets penalties. This again encourages fraud. To see what I mean, let's look at the problem of vote fraud, of which we saw such in examples in 1864 election. The only penalty for stealing the state of Tennessee and Louisiana was forfeit of those states in the congressional vote count. That penalty is not commensurate with the crime. Notice the Congress didn't even award the votes from those states to McClellan, which was logically first step. But the penalty should have been far steeper than that. Fraud on that scale undercuts the entire democracy process and completely short-circuits the representative government. Therefore, it might be argued it is a form of treason. If the Constitution defined vote fraud as treason, the seriousness of the crime would be set, and all penalties up to and including death would be play. If that sounds harsh to you, there are other solutions, just as logical, that do not include death or even jail terms. In my opinion, the best solution in that case would have been to specifically forfeit of the entire election and a permanent ban from seeking public office at any level. This severe penalty would be reversed, of course, for the only most serious and widespread vote fraud. In the most serious case like this, not only should the candidates be punished, his entire staff should be as well. All the top positions in the campaign staff should also be banned from ever taking part in an election, down to the local level. As I have said, if he wants to address fraud, there are ways to do it, but the crime has to be taken seriously. If it isn't, we just encourage everyone increasing amounts of fraud. The companies that bankroll elections should also be brought into penalties, and those penalties should be specified in writing and update to address current needs. For example, in the recent proposition concerning genetically modified food, several indicates of vote manipulation were found, as well as campaign fraud. Monsanto and many other companies were implicated. None of those indications of fraud were properly investigated. But even if they had been, the current penalties are only fines, which the companies simply write off as a business expense. We don't need bigger fines. We need to include any company guilty of voter fraud in the penalty box. Any company involved in voter or campaign fraud should be permanently banned from lobbying, campaign financing, or campaign advertising. Any effort to undermine that ban by channeling money through dummy companies, for instance, should be met with even stiffer penalties, up to and including liquidation of the company and seizing of all assets. I think you will admit that would put an end to the corruption we now see. If these sort of penalties and methods were specified in the Constitution or adjoining documents, Congress could be immediately re-empowered. For example, rather than giving the Justice Department the option of investigating vote and campaign fraud, the Constitution could require it to do so, with specialized penalties for not doing. In that case, both Congress and the Supreme Court could be empowered to step in, applying these penalties against the Justice Department on a constitutional basis. Failure to investigate could be defined as obstruction of justice, and offices could be removed and penalty banned from public office on that base. In the current system, not only is the regulation woefully inadequate, but the penalties, even when specified, are not compensated with the crime. This is because the criminals are the ones writing the legislation and doing the regulating. You will say that it is just the way things are, but a more precise and extended Constitution could have prevented the growth of fraud from the beginning. We have seen that in this case, and it can be discovered in many other major cases throughout America from the beginning, all the way back to the Founding Fathers. Another contradiction can be found in Booth's business venture, which were blue, not gray. For example, Booth invested in Back Bay, Boston. He also had a business partner with John Elser's Drilling for oil in Pennsylvania. Booth never invested in cotton, tobacco, or slave that we know of. This ends the message. The man who wrote this is a brilliant man named Milos Mathis. I have never met the man, but have read the hundreds of essays he has wrote, from Elvis and the CIA to fake wars, all the way up to current events of today's the poke, the slap, and the election. He does an amazing job, as you can see from this paper, linking them all together, and not only showing they are all related, but are all Zionist Jews. And that was the point I wanted to show you this. It will help me in my message on Satan's final plan. I encourage you to read all of his essays, or the ones you find most interesting. You will be shocked at the levels we have been lied to. Although there are a few, I would argue, for the most part he does an amazing job uncovering the truth. His website is milomathis.com, or just Google Milo Mathis. Once there, click on Essays, and then choose any year, and down the real truth rabbit hole you shall go.